Thank you to David. Thank you to Hudson and Rostron, Oxford Brookes University and Socotec for inviting me. And thank you everyone here for still being here. The last session, thank you for showing me some love. So, my name is Dr. Steven Forrest. I'm a lecturer in flood resilience and sustainable transformations. And this isn't working. This isn't working either. Okay, so let's start again. I'm Dr. Steven Forrest. I'm a lecturer in flood resilience and sustainable transformations. I'm also a program director for the MSc in flood risk management at the Energy and Environment Institute, University of Hull. I'm here today to talk to you about flood resilience, post-flood recovery, and to bring some of the UK and maybe international insights here. I'm going to talk a bit, so my background is that I'm in disaster studies, cultural geography, and socio-spatial planning. I'm looking really at flooding and looking at it as a disaster situation, but traditionally we've seen it as very much a problem that can be solved with large-scale engineering solutions, big dikes, big structures, which are far away to keep the water out. In this sense, maybe a narrative of fighting against the water. However, we realize we can't keep fighting against the water. We realize that we need to take a more holistic approach, a more holistic perspective to think about other ways we can manage water. And you might see it in terms of nature-based solutions and a catchment-based approach, looking at where the water lands and how the water moves across the surface. More recently, we're recognizing that that isn't quite sufficient, and the scale has changed. Instead of looking at it something out there, we're now thinking about it in our neighborhoods, on our streets, and in our homes, in our businesses, and in key public service buildings. So we're seeing a shift here from keeping water out to fighting it, to recognizing that this isn't a fight we can win. We can stop it as much as we can, but we need to think not what if a flood happens, what do we do then? But what do we do when the flood happens? It's not just controlling the hazard, it's now reducing the consequences. And I'm going to tell you a bit about flooding. How bad is it? Spoiler, it's quite bad in the UK. I'm going to show a few examples from the UK and internationally, looking at what does it mean to be flood resilient, with a few key points and a few challenges. And then I'm going to focus on one of those challenges. And I'm going to introduce a creative approach of serious gaming or serious board gaming. And I'll tell you a bit about that too. So the clicker's working. So firstly, as promised, the flood challenge. You might have seen it on the news, you might have heard it on the radio. Flooding is a big problem, and it's a global problem. It's not just in the UK. Here are just some news articles, some headlines from the last few months, last year or so. We're seeing it in Northern Europe, even the Netherlands is flooding. We're seeing it in Bangladesh, Florida, the USA, a very rich country, is experiencing flooding. You might have remembered the Brazil floods that happened recently. And I'm told by some friends they flooded over the weekend in the UK. Flooding is happening in a lot of places, and it is a global issue, but also one that is quite significant in the UK. So 6.1 million, that's the number of people in the UK currently living in flood-prone areas. That's quite a large number. And you can even see in this news headline, biblical flash flooding hits the city high street. And this was August 2024. So that's very recent. Over 29,000 UK homes have flooded in the last decade. You can see on the left, the current annual flood damage. And you can see there's a large amount. You can see it's geographically spread out, it's diverse. Different types of flooding. You've got river floods, coastal floods, rainwater. You'll have reservoir flooding. You'll have groundwater flooding. You'll also have your odd pipe burst type of flooding. There's a lot of different types of flooding that exist in the UK. And it's not in one area, as you might see in other countries. It is pretty much everywhere. And there's a seasonality to it as well. By the 2080s, the estimated annual damages from flooding in the UK is predicted to be about 3.5 to 3.9 billion pounds. The 2015 floods, if you remember them on Boxing Day, were estimated to cost around 1.6 billion pounds just for that flood event. Flooding is costly, it's damaging, and it's very disruptive to society. It can cause structural damage, erosion, contamination, also mold and physical and mental health problems. And this is from a survey in Hull from Ramsden and Davidson. And this was looking at the impacts of the 2007 floods. This was undertaken in 2020, over a decade after the floods. And you can see people were affected in terms of their health and well-being. 82% reported mental health consequences from floods. 37% reported physical health consequences. It's not just what we can physically see, it's also what might be harder to put our finger on, harder to see, and might only come out later. And there's even reports where children who weren't affected by the floods are feeling anxious every time there's heavy rainfall. It's transmitted across a generation, this fear of flooding. It can affect homes and businesses, schools, transport, public services, communication networks, supply chains, economic activity, parks and green spaces. It is something that is very pervasive. But what do we do about it? How do we manage these floods? Well, we have these traditional approaches. I'm sure you all recognize this one. Thames Barrier. Anyone recognize this one on the right? The what? Yeah, Delta Works in the Netherlands. These are traditional engineering approaches which are designed to keep water out, to offer protection to those living behind them. But there are some problems. So you might remember this, Whaley Bridge. And what you have here is, I think it's Todsbrook Reservoir, and water actually ended up going behind the spillway. And it led to kind of a collapse of those areas. And you have these sandbags, they're about, I think, a ton of ballast in each. That's a lot being put there. This is something which is supposed to, downstream, there's a little village, there's a town, people live there. Imagine seeing that on your doorstep. This didn't fail in the end, but it shows some of the weaknesses that we have. And you can even see here, this is a few years ago, how bad are they and what is being done? Questions over the capability of flood defenses and how money is being spent. And if you looked recently, you were paying attention to the news earlier this year, you'll see that flood defenses have deteriorated in all regions of England. They've got worse. So we can see here, this is where they were in 2018. These are those classed as poor or very poor. And then in 2022, the number in each region has increased. So we need to think about, so we have some problems and we have some other future challenges. We have to think we're going to have more extreme events, a change in the frequency and intensity, so more frequent flood events or heavy rainfall events, more rainfall in a smaller amount of time. It's also how we build our cities, whether we're developing in floodplains or flood risk areas or areas we know flood. We need to take that into account. So as I said at the beginning, it's no longer if, but more when. When will the next flood happen? And I know this might seem a bit doom and gloom. I'm sorry about that. It's disaster studies. I still have a smile on my face talking about disasters, but I'm very passionate about this topic. Don't worry though, we're going to get into happier times. So now we're going to talk about what we're doing to manage it. And as I said, it's from controlling the hazard to reducing the consequences, from fail-safe projects to safe to fail. And as part of this, we're shifting to a flood resilience and living with water approach. We're going from keeping the water out to living with water, from traditional flood defenses to more holistic flood resilience approaches. These encourage multifunctional use of floodplains, using the land to store water, maybe temporarily, looking at it for recreation, biodiversity, and other uses. You can see here the site. If you contrast it to the Thames tidal barrier, you can contrast it to the Delta Works, big defenses far away. These are now on our doorsteps. These are in our streets. The scale has changed as to where we're managing flooding. When I say flood resilience, as an academic, there are many ways I can talk about it and define it. To put it simply, we can just call it as an idea that we cannot prevent every flood. We should still try to stop the floods, don't get me wrong, but we're also acknowledging we can't stop every one of them. So we need to also think about reducing flood consequences. So trying to keep the water out, but if some water does get in, it shouldn't cause much disruption or damage. We need to focus on that. And it's going from being adapted, we know this will happen, we will build a wall this high, to being adaptable. This is a changing future risk. We need to be able to modify the defenses or the approaches that we have in place. We have to have the capacity to respond to uncertainty. And part of this is learning from the recent past, from the events, but also much further back. And then the flexibility in mindset, in institutional setup, but also in willingness to experiment. So how do we get there? Well, when we're thinking about flood resilience, you can think of opportunities and you can think of challenges here. In terms of how many people have heard of PFR? 2 people, 3, 4, a few people have heard of PFR. So I'm going to hit PFR, and in this sense, I'm talking about property flood resistance, but there's also property flood resilience with the same acronym. So I said we're trying to keep the water out. We're still trying to do that. On a household scale, we might be including floodgates, flood doors, as you can see here. We might be thinking about smaller solutions such as non-return valves, self-closing air bricks, air brick covers. There are lots of ways that we can look at keeping the water out of the house. But they're very costly, and people might not know that they're at flood risk, let alone that these measures exist. If we had a flood door and tacked on a few self-closing air bricks, that's about £2,000. Now, in this room, I've told you about flooding. I was a bit doom and gloom at the beginning, but we're getting happier. If I said I'd give you £2,000, would you use it to get a flood door and 2 self-closing air bricks and have them installed, or would you use that for a holiday? So there's a gap here. And maybe this isn't a popular choice, but these are the choices that people have. Community members who are now seeing floodwaters in their streets, who are now thinking about how to make their houses ready for flooding, have to make these types of choices. In Hull, we've started doing PFR, so property flood resistance testing, in our total environment simulator. So this, you can see a bit on the scale. You can fit quite a few people in there. We use it to model rivers and look at rivers and sedimentation and how they change over time. What we've been recently doing is testing whether we can use it to simulate flooding and the force of water on different flood doors and flood gates to test PFR. This is something that can help in terms of benchmarking standards, having a higher level of standards and then testing to see, do these products meet these requirements? Because in some cases, especially post-flood disaster, there are some rogue traders that sell you anything that's claiming to be a flood door, but will buckle at the first sight of water. So we need to be careful about that. We've also got sustainable urban drainage systems. Now, this is part of the idea of where the water lands. We're trying to store it, trying to slow it and reduce the amount of water reaching the public sewers. If you have a large amount of water in one area, we want to slow it because the main sewer system will be drawing water from lots of different places in your city. If they're all full, if there's lots of water coming to the same point, you're creating a new localized flood problem. So SUDs are trying to store it, and you might see it trying to mimic vegetation, trying to slow it in the types of soils. This is on our building, and here's the pipe, and here is a monitoring station, and it's just got a normal tip bucket, often used for milking cows, but this tip bucket is used for SUDs, and it measures the amount of water going through, so that we can record how much water is coming into the system of what we estimate should come off based on the weather and our recordings of rainfall, but also the surface area of the roof. We have this extra element because we don't want to flood here if there's too much water coming through. The water comes through and we have this pit. We have these as well, and these are planters, and this is where the water is stored. So in this way, we're trying to store water in the urban environment. We're trying to overcome this challenge of having loads of impermeable surfaces which don't let water through by creating some which store it and hopefully naturally release it. I've got a few international examples of this. I was in Malmö in Sweden, and I thought this was a lovely idea. of integrating water into the landscape, into this residential area. They've built it this way by design. You can see it's very aesthetically pleasing, greenery, water, that makes it a more desirable place to live. It's integrated it together, but it's also created a space for water. People can see water in their environment. They can see when the water levels might be rising. It's also a place where water can be stored safely. Now, we don't all have these kind of blank slates on which we can put urban planning interventions. Sometimes we have different types of buildings, and we're having to work with buildings that already exist, and we need to try and make intelligent modifications. Here you can see the pipes coming down, and each of them feed into a bit of a gully. And then these are directed across the urban landscape into watery spaces. In this way, it's controlling the water, it's managing and guiding it, and trying to avoid water pooling up in certain locations, as well as kind of decoupling it from the main sewage system. In the Netherlands, they also integrate water into urban spaces. So this is in Rotterdam. And what they've done here is they've taken this plaza, this common space. It was helped that this was all owned by one company, one residential company, so they could make these interventions. And then they've created a series of channels and spaces where the water can be directed into these areas. When there's water, water can be stored here. When there's no water, this can be a public space. Kids can play there. You can't see in this picture, but they had a few football goals about this high, not really big ones. Some markings on the floor as well. So it's multifunctional. And I said there was another PFR, as well as property flood resistance, we have property flood resilience. And this is thinking about not only keeping the water out, but what happens if the water gets in? It's reducing the consequences. And you can see it might be about raising plug points, having quick release hinges for doors. It might be thinking about waterproof wallboards as opposed to traditional gypsum-based plasterboards. You might be doing horizontal installation instead of vertical, so it's easier to remove affected places as opposed to the entirety of it. There's a lot of different approaches, and it might also be thinking about removing soft furnishings such as carpets, replacing them with rugs, looking at impermeable surfaces. When the water comes in, and maybe it lasts there for a few hours or days if you're unlucky, once the water has been pumped out, the water has left the building, the cleanup and the decontamination can be done very speedily. In this way, people might have some disruption, but the damage will be reduced. Within this, as I alluded to earlier, we're really seeing a change in scale from engineering solutions, catchment-based, to street, neighborhood, and homes. And in this, we kind of have a social shift in flood risk management. It's not just the government's responsibility. It's not just those who manage the land, it's those who live in those flood risk areas. And what we can see is a growing role for communities. And they can take physical actions, they can exchange knowledge about flood risk, and also take advocacy actions such as petitioning, protesting, trying to put political pressure on authorities to take action. Flood warnings and alerts. How many people in this room have signed up to flood alerts from the Environment Agency? I see a few people. Good job. They might be confusing though. Sometimes I've signed up and I get a lot of false warnings and a lot of warnings which just say, beware, it might flood. What do I do with that? So there's a bit of a gap here as well in terms of the usefulness of the warnings. Warnings on their own don't mean much if they don't have an action attached to them. But we're seeing a greater role for the social. And there is a journey that people in flood risk places or people across the country need to take, but very few do. And it's motivation, thinking first, am I at risk? Have I checked a flood risk map provided for free by the government? You can just put your postcode in online. Have I checked if I'm at flood risk? What type of flood risk might I be at? Is it my responsibility Is there something that can help if it does flood? Can I afford it to take action? And is it cost effective? Can I avoid any unintended consequences, any maladaptation from doing so? And you have to go through this journey at every stage. Even know or don't know, you might think, yeah, I'm done. I engaged with it a bit. I checked the flood risk map. I couldn't quite understand it. I'm sure I'll be fine. Hull is the second most flood risk place in the UK, yet only about 10 to 15% of people there have signed up to flood alerts. It's a bowl with significant flood risk and recent events, yet flood risk awareness is quite low. The number who've even looked at their own flood risk and signed up is very low, especially relative to other areas with lower amounts of flood risk. So there is a challenge. These individual determinants affect whether someone takes action or doesn't. And that can influence whether they take, for example, PFR measures or they choose not to. And we're essentially, and Venice, sorry, some of these are just holiday photos. Wherever I go, I like taking pictures of water, flooded things. It's great. And with Venice in Italy, you can really see it as resisting and also embracing water. So trying to keep it out, but recognizing that a lot of water will come into the spaces. And you have these flood doors, which are scattered across the historical buildings there. But you also have more practical solutions, thinking it's going to rain anyway, or we're going to have the water in these public spaces. Why don't we put these barriers or these platforms up so people can still navigate around these areas? You also have, in addition to the structural, the social. You have the flood doors, you have sirens, but then you also need local knowledge to know what the siren means. You need to know where to be evacuated to, where are the safe spaces. And some people just, you may have seen these shoes, these shoe coverings, and just walking through the water. A bit of water is okay. To summarize what I've covered, we've made some current progress, and here are just some of the measures. Insights is about integrating water into urban spaces, redeveloping our spaces around, and recognizing the aesthetic benefits of water. But there are a lot of challenges, including low public flood risk awareness, a gap between knowing and action. Knowledge of PFR measures are often lost when the building changes hands. When new tenants come in, they might replace flood doors, not realizing they're flood doors. If there's no changeover or transfer of information, that knowledge is lost. There's also the cost of actions, skills availability to implement them, and a question of who is responsible. Should it be the government? Is it the landowner? Is it the person who built the building? Are the developers, streets, neighborhoods, or collectives? Who is responsible? Because there's also a cost implication. Who should pay? Within this, you also have to think about how we can conserve the past, how we can look at local guidelines, for example, conservation areas, and adapt or become flood resilient within these constraints. And think about where we can learn from abroad, but also in the past as well. And a challenge I'd focus on, which I think encapsulates a lot of that, is engaging people. How do we increase flood risk awareness and build capacity to become flood resilient? Now, this is also when I was in Prague. You can see buildings here having physical flood markers. Now, that's quite scary. That says the river Vltava was at that level 14th of August 2022. That is very high. That's quite a visual reminder from the building of the water got this high at one point. You can see also memories stored in buildings. This is in the Netherlands, and it's talking in Middelburg, which was affected, I think, by the 1953 floods. And here it's talking about the city and the rain. It's talking about the relationship with rain and the raindrops. And here in York, you're seeing this showing that flooding has happened many times in the past. This is 1831, all the way to 2000. And it's the history on the buildings themselves, the memories of floods. And you see these on bars and cafes. And this is in Germany. And you can see Papa Joe's, what's that say? Jazz box, jazz local. And then next to it, in between here and the menu, here's the flood level. So that's quite prominently displayed, but maybe overlooked. How do we use buildings and the memories that they have to engage people in the stories behind them? And one way is through serious gaming. Now, serious gaming, if you get bored, if you want to play a game later, you can go onto the UNDRR website, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, look for Stop Disasters. That's great. But do it when you have time to procrastinate. I warn you now. And then you essentially have to take a series of different actions in order to prepare against a series of different disaster events. And you have a set of resources, you make changes to the landscape, and then you simulate the disaster. This is brilliant because you can simulate a disaster without any of the real-world consequences of the disaster. It can be useful for exploring different options, but also understanding the value of each of the options. And these serious games, not only have they been used in disaster studies, but they have been used across these management, these maybe more social science related questions that exist. Serious gaming, as I've said, games which are not meant to be played solely for entertainment. They're experimental, experiential, rule-based interactive environments where players learn by taking actions and by experiencing their effects through feedback mechanisms that are deliberately built into and around the game. Traditional ones that you probably are aware of are chess, military drills, medical rehabilitation, including the use of prosthetics, and training for people who need to have prosthetics and need to learn how to use them, especially for fine motor skills. CBRNE, emergency training scenarios. Gamification exists in a lot of the things that we do, and it's a very useful way to build capacity and to start conversations on topics. And in flooding, you have flood snakes and ladders. You have this one, which was made by the Environment Agency, which was Flood Sim, and you took a set of decisions and you could see these manifest over time. Was cutting down all your trees the best solution for flooding? Probably not. And has anyone ever played Pandemic? Yeah, the board game, yeah. And you had the water moving around. Oh, sorry, the disease cubes. And you don't want an outbreak, otherwise you're in trouble. They've got a floods version. It was made when the games convention was in the Netherlands. And they thought, what's Dutch? And they were like, water management. Let's combine Pandemic. This was pre-COVID. Let's combine Pandemic with flooding. And then you're going back in time as you try and make these infrastructural engineering solutions in the Netherlands, whilst also understanding the role of windmills, of dikes, of natural spaces, and the need for collaboration. We made a game. So we were approached by the Aviva Foundation to understand more about flood recovery and to identify the gaps. Flood recovery, you have a flood, it's quite bad, generally bad. And a lot of people try and take actions. They try and recover. And you have the people who have been flooded. You have people who might not have been flooded who are supporting them. You might have different authorities, the Environment Agency. You might have the local council. You might have fire and rescue service, police forces, utilities companies. A lot of different actors are there. And they're all trying to do different bits. But sometimes they don't connect. They don't communicate with one another. So there are gaps appearing. But we don't know where these gaps are until it's too late. So we were asked to find a way to identify flood recovery gaps. And we had to identify them by bringing in different stakeholders. And we used a multi-method research approach, and we used a game that we developed as a research tool to collect data in a fun way for the participants. And we built the flood recovery game. Now this game, which exists, and you'll see it on your way out, is not for sale. We only have about 20 copies, and this is for research and knowledge exchange. That's what we're focusing on. And we're trying to engage with as many people as we can on it. We're at Flood and Coast and other national conferences and events. And we've also worked with local volunteers playing through the game to understand their perspectives. It's a game that's been iteratively developed over time. And we've changed it to try and be sensitive to the needs and the fact that it is a traumatic experience, whilst also recognizing the potential for the game to help us answer gaps, answer questions that we don't know exist yet. So we tested it in the Humber region. The game itself was from interviews with about 20 practitioners and policymakers who'd been involved in flood recovery. It was through a systematic literature review of international and UK academic papers. And it was also through the use of UK policy papers over the last 10 years and policy notes and flood recovery investigation reports. So a lot of actual academic and practical experiences came and was synthesized into a game that we tried to use to capture the complexity of the situation whilst also making it playable. And people play the game, they take rounds, and they tell their story, and through it we collect data. But it's not just us who benefits, because the people who come can also talk to each other. They know the gaps as they emerge, and they can also work together to identify and prioritize those gaps. This is what the game looks like. We have 13 common scenarios. We have resource cards. We have different role cards. And it starts off as being competitive to semi-collaborative to fully collaborative. It starts with plentiful resources, which you never really have when you're managing flooding, to restricted resources, to more of an austerity approach where you have very minimal resources. So it tries to mimic real life, as well as trying to go beyond the silos, break down those barriers. We get data. The players afterwards help analyze the data. So we don't just take the data away and then write a report, and then they might see it or they might not in a paper that's behind a paywall. We actually analyze it with them. And one event that we did in phase 1 was in Hull Truck Theatre. We had 33 representatives and community members from 6 different actors. So these are some of those involved. You see there's quite a diversity of experiences there. And through this, we created relationships that may not have existed before. People identified problems and others actually provided solutions to those problems. So it was a tool which was fun to deliver as well. People enjoyed it. But imagine that's 33 people in a workshop from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., a workshop where we had loads of snacks, had lunch. There was networking spaces, playing the game, having the workshop and developing the ideas. If you were doing a traditional research approach, you might have done interviews. Then you would have had 1 hour long interviews with everybody to work out what happened. That would be 33 hours of interviews. 33 hours of interviews followed by transcription, which normally takes 3 to 4 hours per hour of recorded material, checking and writing. So it's also a time saver as well as being something that's engaging, something that the stakeholders actually wanted to come back and do more research. They were really engaged in it. As part of, I missed this bit, but I'm coming to the end now, and I've told you a little bit about one creative approach. As part of the Risky Cities project in Hull, we also have this zine. And I've got a few copies next to the table, and I'm more than happy for people to take them. It lightens my load on the way back to Hull. And there's just different stories. We work with a local artist, and you can see some of the ideas of flooding. And within it, we also have a flood timeline, which tells us all about the floods that have hit Hull over the last few hundred years. So these types of creative approaches to engaging communities is quite important if we're trying to enact change, if we're trying to get from knowing something to taking action on something. And this game is something that can be modified for different contexts and situations. A key thing linked to this is that flood recovery provides a window of opportunity. A window of opportunity for change. Something significant has happened. The system that exists has been shaken up. Now's the time for new ideas. It's not thinking about how do we go back to how it was? How do we put our buildings, how do we put our streets back as they were? It's now thinking, how do we adapt? How do we bring people on board to make the changes that we know we need? How do we go from being adapted to adaptable? And as part of this, we need to identify solutions now. before the floods. And we need to think of how we can implement these solutions before we're asked to implement them. So over the last 2 days, or days yesterday, I've heard a lot of different approaches, lots of really interesting presentations. In a lot of cases, it's we need to do something. There's something that needs to be done, a problem that needs a solution. Flooding and other disaster events provide an opportunity for these solutions to be implemented at great speed and in a wider space than in normal times. Because people are looking to rebuild. Why don't we offer them the chance to build back better? Because flooding is not a natural disaster. This is AI generated, by the way. I asked it to look at flood disasters and show some of the social inequality with flood disasters. And you can see, same disaster. It took a few iterations. The first ones were really bad. You can see the same type of flood disaster, but very different consequences. If we're going to a point where we're not just fighting the water, we're living with water, we're reducing consequences, we need to think some people have more capacity to do so. They have greater skills, they have more awareness, they might be richer, they might be more connected. Whereas some areas will have the same event, the same type of conditions, but suffer much greater. And in this way, flooding isn't a natural disaster. The water's natural, might be a lot of it, that's natural, but the disaster only really happens when it meets the social system, when it meets our cities, meets our towns, meets our homes, our businesses, and then it highlights the weaknesses and vulnerabilities that were already there. And those weaknesses and vulnerabilities are then put on show for everyone to see. So it's really about preventative work and looking at flood recovery as a window of opportunity, but it doesn't mean that we wait till the flood itself. We start thinking about it now. We start looking to cross silos, to form the partnerships, to identify the questions and then answer them in advance of the flood disasters. And to conclude, this is one of the aqua greens in Hull, and this was built to store water post-2007 and the flood events there, described as the largest peacetime emergency since World War II. This is functioning well. It's supposed to have water there. To summarize, flooding is an urgent societal challenge in the UK. 6.1 million people, over 29,000 homes flooded in the last decade, a prediction of 3.5 to 3.9 billion pounds worth of damage going into the future, into the 2080s. It is something we need to look at, but it's not just the days of water engineers leading the charge. We're recognizing that there are different solutions and different approaches needed, and the conversations need to extend further than they've ever gone before. There's a shift here in terms of the approaches from keeping water out to living with water. There's thinking about how we raise awareness of flood risk and actions that can be taken at the property and neighborhood levels. How do we roll these out? How do we engage people to then modify their buildings, modify their neighborhoods and their streets so that it is more flood resilient? We can use creative community engagement practices such as the game, such as the zine, but also think about buildings as physical memories. People walking by, people living in that space can see that the water got up there, can start conversations. How can we develop this further? How do buildings need to change into the future? And how can we think about building back better and pursuing flood resilience? And as a question for you to think about, to reflect on, who should be responsible for this? Who should be responsible for making sure we're flood resilient? And who should be paying for this? I'll draw it to an end. Thank you for listening.